Hey! Welcome back to Cryptic Creatures, the show where I give you the inside scoop on the details of a specific creature from mythology, folklore, cryptozoology, or literature. I'm your host, local monster nerd, and notorious Monday hater, Mothmancha. I first want to thank you all for the support on the first episode of this show. I know it didn't blow up or anything, I didn't really expect it to, but I really appreciate how much everyone seems to be enjoying the video I made, and I've never been more excited to sit down and just do research for a couple of hours so I can work on this series. I have a lot of really fun ideas I can't wait to start working on. I have way too many. Special shout out to this guy. Support like this is why I do what I do. Thanks, XXMenOBXX. In this episode of Cryptic Creatures, we're going to step away from Greece and head towards the Middle East, because we're talking about the Roc. I can't believe you let me get away with that twice in a row, damn. But this is a nice change in talking about Cerberus, who is a creature that I think most people are pretty familiar with. Greek mythology is very popular. The Roc, however, seems to be a creature that a lot of people don't actually know about. Before researching for this video, I even only knew like 2 rock facts.
It's a rock fact!
Which are that the Roc is an absolutely ginormous bird, and that they could carry away elephants as their prey. That's right! The Roc is just a big old bird. The biggest bird, perhaps.
I'm the biggest bird, I'm the biggest bird.
Not anymore, Saint Mercator. Unfortunately, the Roc is a substantially less popular mythological creature compared to Cerberus. I did a poll in one of the Discord servers that I moderate and got these results. Out of the people who I polled, 60 people knew who Cerberus was. 12 of these people also knew who the Roc was. 10 of them thought that they knew who the Roc was, and 5 people had no idea about either creature. Since I use Discord Reacts, I also checked through, and there was nobody who knew or had heard of the Roc, but not Cerberus. The bright side of this, however, is that there's a good chance you're gonna learn something from this video. I learned a lot of things while writing this video, so it's fun for everyone, baby! I don't have any beating around the bush to do today. Let's start with the etymology of the Roc. Like Cerberus, the Roc is a modernized version of the original creature's name. Roc traces back to Persian, where it was spelled rukh, or rukh. There's no huge debate over the name's origin this time either. It just goes back to Persian and that's that. Honestly, I'm a little disappointed it was this easy. I only included this sentence I'm saying right now to kind of pad out the chapter breaks. Silly me, right? But when it comes to physical descriptions of the Roc, however, this is a lot more difficult to ascertain. We know that the Roc is a giant bird of prey, and that's where the well of easy to find information dries up. A lot of depictions show the Roc as a giant eagle, but I don't think that I'd actually be able to climb up into this creature and make my usual grocery purchases of 10 frozen pizzas and a case of Monster Energy. Someone let me know if I'm wrong and the Roc does do curbside delivery. Most stories also describe the Roc as being large enough to carry away an elephant or a rhinoceros in its claws. That should be a pretty useful sense of scale. Elephants are usually 3 to 7 tons heavy, that's like 6,000 to 14,000 pounds. Whatever the metric system is, I put that on the screen as well, right here, probably. Description-wise, though, most basic explanations of the Roc don't actually tell us what kind of bird it is, although we can guess. Therefore, in a departure from how I normally want to do things, we're gonna jump straight into reading some of the stories about the Roc and talking about that first, and we're gonna see if we can find any identifying traits about the Roc in the stories. Sources for the original stories involving the Roc trace back to Arabian folklore, especially the 1001 Nights stories. This is the same book that folklore like Aladdin and genies and magic carpets come from, and believe it or not, Bahamut is popularized by D&D and Final Fantasy. So we're gonna read through those first. 1001 Nights, as I ended up finding out, is a really fun source material. It's a very large anthology of various folk tales all strung together through a framing device. Now, if you're not familiar, the story follows Central Asia's King Shahryar, who hates women because his wife cheated on him. Shahryar marries a new woman each day and kills them on the next, so they can't cheat on him. Because, as is usual, no other solutions other than murder exist. Now, the daughter of the king's vizier, Scheherazade, forms a plan to stop this terrible cycle once and for all, and she eventually gets married to Shahryar. That night, she starts telling a story to the Sultan. The story is long and she ends up ending on a cliffhanger, but the Sultan is so intrigued that he actually allows Scheherazade to live another night so that she can finish the story. The next night, she finishes the story and starts another one. This continues for over 2.5 years, or, as some might put it, 1001 nights. Roll credits, they finally fall in love for good. I'm serious this time, they do. That's how the frame story ends. So I'm going to be tackling these stories in the order that they are told in 1001 Nights. So this first story would have been told between the 9th and 18th nights, and it's called The Story of the Third Royal Mendicant. If you're unfamiliar with what a mendicant is, like I was before reading the story, it's another word for a beggar, someone who begs for food for living instead of, having a job and stuff. Now, this is actually a frame story inside of a frame story. The setup for the story of the 3 royal mendicants is called The Porter and the 3 Ladies. And in this story, 3 beggars, each blind in their right eye, show up at a mansion where they are told that they cannot ask for any explanation of what goes on at the house. They end up asking for explanations on what goes on in the house and offending the ladies of the house, and are set to be executed. Unless they tell a particularly interesting story. Sound familiar? Yeah. We end up finding out that each of the 3 mendicants also all used to be royalty, and the 3rd mendicant's name was King Ajib, and he was an avid sailor. One day, while sailing in strange waters, his ship comes within the radius of a very powerful mountain of black lodestone. This is so magnetic that the iron on the ship is not only attracted to the mountain once they get in range, but when they get close enough, the ship is actually going to be torn asunder, just completely destroyed. They're pulled towards this mountain and the ship is destroyed. King Ajib, however, survives the ship's complete obliteration, however, and after a lot of trial and tribulation, ends up making it to an island. On this island, he discovers a trap door with a prince being hidden inside of it. And apparently, we learn that prophecy states that this prince is going to be killed in 10 days by a man named King Ajib. This is a good time to remind you, by the way, that attempting to defy a prophecy never f***ing works, and any attempt to try just makes the story funnier. So, King Ajib, who considered himself a decent person who had no reason to kill this prince, decides to become the prince's attendant for the next 10 days, just to make sure he stays safe. And he would never murder this nice young man. He's a good guy. The prince, by the way, has no idea that this man is named King Ajib, and so he has no reason to be scared. So on the final 10th day, the prince asks for the king to carve up a melon. So Ajib grabs a knife and prophecy strikes as he trips, stabbing and instantly killing the prince. Ajib absconds, and after about 2 months of travel across this island, he reaches a palace. There are 10 young men who live in this palace, and they're all a little quirky, and they're blind in one eye. They also undergo some really interesting rituals. Upon poking and prodding from Ajib, who at this point we understand just can't stay out of anyone's business, they reveal that their afflictions, their blindness, and their weird rituals occur due to finding a golden palace covered in rubies and emeralds. So finally, what we've all been waiting for, to send Ajib to this palace, who must see it. He can't stand not seeing it. They slaughter a ram, they have Ajib hide inside of it, and wait for it to be picked up by an enormous white bird. This bird carries him to the palace, where Ajib cuts his way out of the ram, and the Roc, seeing him, flies off. The story continues to go on after this. I highly recommend you giving it a read. I'll have a link to it in the description in the source document that I'll have on every one of these videos, because I had to cut a lot out of it for what ends up being 3 sentences about the Roc. Realistically, I could have cut a lot more, but it's so interesting. Like, the mountain made out of magnetic metal, I think, is really cool, especially. And I didn't want to cut anything out. But if you want to see how the story ends, again, there's a link in the description. The next story from 1001 Nights doesn't appear until the 5th volume, and oh, just in case you're curious, I'm using the Richard Burton translation, which is pretty well known. It's also in the description. So this new story is called Abd al-Rahman, the Maghribi Story of the Rukh. This looks much more hopeful for us since the Rukh's name is in the title. By the way, if you're keeping track, this story is told around night 405. In this story, which is much shorter than the last one, by the way, Abd al-Rahman, a traveler from West Africa, has with him the quill of a wing feather of a young Rukh, which supposedly is big enough to hold a goat skin of water. It also quotes that the wing of a young, just hatched Rukh is as long as 1,000 fathoms. Nowadays, a fathom is approximately 6 feet, but back when this was written, it would have been around the arm span of a sailor with his arms stretched out. So if we do all the math, that's like 12,000 feet. Comparing this to like the Dungeons & Dragons Roc, the D&D Roc is about 120-foot wingspan. So this is likely some Pokedex level hyperbole from 1001 Nights. Anyways, Abd al-Rahman comes across a mystical roc's egg, which is about 100 cubits long. Yeah, don't you love all these weird units of measurement? Hey, they're still better than acres. Don't get me started with acres. I hate acres. Did you know acres are rectangle shaped? Sorry, cubits are weird, though. There's no consistent size for them, but roughly it's between 18 and 20 inches depending on the source that you're looking at. So if my math is correct and my understanding of these units is correct, that's about 166.6 feet for the Roc's egg, if you've already forgotten. The travelers crack the egg open with pickaxes, yoink out some of the wing feathers and some rock meat, and leave. The Mama Roc notices this, though, and starts to chase them, and it almost destroys the ship by trying to drop a boulder on it. Luckily, the boulder misses and the craft is able to escape, and later, the crew roasts up and eats the rock flesh that they had harvested from the baby. They wake up the next day, though, and find out that the rock flesh has some sort of youthful property to it. All of the sailors with white hair and beards wake up to having found that their hair has regained its color. It's really cool. So the moment that they open up a Kentucky Fried Rucks, or a Kentucky Fried Chicken, I don't know, I'll be the first in line, that's for sure. Now, speaking of the stolen Roc's feather, by the way, there's a common association with Roc's feathers and fronds from the raffia palm, which were sometimes allegedly passed off as Roc's feathers. These fronds can be up to 60 or 70 feet long. That's like a huge-ass leaf, so it's not hard to believe that people used to think that they were giant rock feathers, which is more interesting than a big-ass leaf. Now, that's not all for 1001 Nights at Freddy's. On night 544, Scheherazade is continuing the story of the second voyage of Sinbad the Sailor. You've probably heard of Sinbad, more commonly referred to as Sinbad, as a character who goes on a lot of different seafaring adventures and runs into some wild things along the way. Very much a I'm going on an adventure for fame and fortune kind of story, which is always lovely. We love those. So during his second voyage, Sinbad recalls stories of the Roc, which supposedly feeds elephants to its children. You gotta wonder if it chews up the elephants and regurgitates them into the baby Roc's mouths, because I guarantee you it's easier to eat a worm than it is to eat an elephant. I don't have experience with that, but trust me. Sinbad ends up finding a huge white dome in the middle of an island and realizes that it is a roc's egg. The roc itself then alights on top of the dome to sleep, and Sinbad, crazy motherfucker that he is, ties a makeshift rope around the bird's leg and waits for it to wake up and fly off, just so he can see where it goes. Sinbad ends up finding a valley full of gigantic vipers that were nocturnal because of, the giant bird that they were scared of, the fucking bird that they hate. Interestingly enough, the fifth voyage of Sinbad on night 556 tells a story that is almost exactly the same as Abd al-Rahman's earlier. Sinbad's crew finds a roc's egg, cracks it open to harvest some roc meat, and ends up getting chased by the creature. In this story, however, the roc chasing them is actually successful in dropping a boulder on the ship and it's completely destroyed, though, of course, Sinbad escapes safely. By the way, I did end up searching through all 16 volumes of the Richard Burton translation of Nights. There are a few other times it's mentioned in passing, and some of them are very similar to the stories I've already mentioned, so I'm skipping those. In volume 16, though, we actually get our best real description of the bird itself. Suddenly, there alighted between his hands a snow-white fowl as huge as the dome of a hammam, with shanks like trunks of a palm tree. A hammam is a Turkish steam house. From what I can tell, this implies a smaller roc than some of the last stories. The snow-white feathers are very interesting, though. This is the second time that the roc is described as being white in coloration, and I quite like that. Now, in my first draft of the script, I stopped Nights here, but I imagine some of you may have noticed that I missed a story, if you know this well, because I almost forgot to talk about Aladdin. Now, somehow I missed it through my initial search through the Burton translations, but I eventually went back after hearing that the roc was mentioned in the story of Aladdin and found it in volume 13. I also found some other translations of the story that do mention it as well, so this isn't just like a Richard Burton thing. The Aladdin story, by the way, you may know, is very different from the Disney version. For instance, instead of Jafar, who is actually from a different story, the main villain is just a magician who pretends to be Aladdin's uncle, tricks him, and then tasks him with finding the magic lamp. Aladdin ends up with both a magic ring and a magic lamp that both have genies inside of them, and my favorite detail, Aladdin's mom doesn't have dead Disney parent syndrome. Anyways, near the very end of the story, they kill the evil magician by tricking him into drinking poison, and then the evil magician's brother, who is also evil, tries to trick the princess, and therefore Aladdin into procuring a roc's egg. And we'll find out immediately why this is bad, because Aladdin asks for the genie's help with this, and the genie freaks out. He threatens Aladdin and mentions that the roc is somehow the genie's master, which is really cool. Presumably, I think the magician was hoping that the genie would get mad enough to kill Aladdin on the spot just for daring to say that. But very luckily, the genie just gives him a warning, and they end up defeating the second magician. So now we finally talked about every time the roc is mentioned in 1001 Nights. But that's not all we've got to talk about. You may have heard of Marco Polo, the explorer, and he wrote about the roc as well, believe it or not. Though likely not as a tale, but supposedly as an actual description of a bird. Marco Polo wrote, "It was for all the world like an eagle, but one indeed of tremendous size. So big, in fact, that its quills were 12 paces long and thick in proportion. And it is so strong that it will seize an elephant in its talons and carry him high into the air and drop him so that he's smashed to pieces. Having so killed him, the bird swoops down on him and eats him at leisure." If you're familiar with mythology and folklore, you might know that the roc shares a lot of similarities with a couple of other creatures, most notably the simurgh. Persian and Iranian mythology talks about the simurgh, which is a gigantic yet notably benevolent bird. It's very likely a large peacock. The simurgh, like the roc, is also prone to carrying away and eating large megafauna. Description-wise, though, we get a lot more about the simurgh. It's always female, it has iridescent feathers, healing magic, avatar element bending, and lacking omniscience. I'm not going to go super in depth on the Simurgh. I think there's a lot of information on it that I could end up doing another video on in the future, but I do think it's really important to mention that it's very likely that the legend of the Roc is linked to the legend of the Simurgh in some sort of way. There are also other birds that could be linked to this myth, like the Ziz from Jewish mythology and the Garuda. But again, we're gonna tackle some of those in later episodes, so I'm not gonna focus on it now. So, giant bird. There are some big birds out there, and I'm not just talking about that 8-foot first grader. Think of the biggest bird, and I mean the actual biggest existing bird that explorers like Marco Polo may have seen that would have also inspired tales of this magnificent creature. Probably would have been from Africa, maybe flightless. Actually, think about it. I'm going to give you a moment. Do you have one in mind? Good. We're going to say it at the same time. 1, 2, 3, elephant bird. If you said ostrich, you just got tricked. Now, when I talk about the elephant bird, I'm actually talking about a family of extinct birds in the family Apiorthornidae, specifically Apiornis maximus. If for some reason you heard elephant bird and thought I was referring to that weird little freak from Horton Hatches the Egg, then that rocks. I'm happy someone else remembered Morton. I love that little guy. But Apiornis maximus, who from this point on I'm going to call the elephant bird because it's easier, was a real species of very large flightless birds that once lived on the island of Madagascar. They went extinct probably close to the time Marco Polo would have encountered them, so probably the late 1200s, although we don't have an exact date on this, of course. They're explicitly named elephant birds because of their enormous size, and some scholars also equate Marco Polo's description of the Roc being able to carry away elephants as inspiring the name of this actual animal. Elephant bird eggs are also really interesting because an elephant bird egg would be approximately 160 times the size of a small little chicken egg. That's 13 inches long, 22 pounds, and an omelet I desperately want to eat. Just imagine sharing the elephant omelet with you and the bros or the gals or whoever your closest group of besties is. Now, I think that takes us to the pop culture section on the Roc, finally. Now, I personally was familiar with only a couple instances of the Roc existing, so I'm going to mention those, and I also want to thank TV Tropes for compiling a great list of times the Roc appears. I've picked out some of my favorites from that list of things that either are appearances of the Roc or are very likely huge references to the Roc. Now, surprisingly enough, I'd never watched the DreamWorks Sinbad Legend of the Seven Seas movie, but I caught a handful of scenes while researching this video, and the Roc's in the movie, and it's a really, really cool take, all things considered. DreamWorks' Roc is not an eagle, but like a huge snowy owl type of monster, and it has ice magic, believe it or not. It swoops in on Sinbad's ship and freezes the entire area just as soon as it gets close. And what's cool is that, overall, none of this depiction contradicts anything we know about the Roc. Anything that's been set into stone anyways. Since the description of the Roc has been pretty vague up to this point, and we've got a giant snow white bird, technically it works. And I really like this version of the monster, and I wish that we got more of it, but unfortunately the Roc isn't the main big bad of the movie, so it's only in a couple of scenes. Now, another thing that I haven't watched are the live-action Disney movies that are coming out right now, like the remakes. So somehow I missed in the Aladdin remake when Jafar turns Iago into a giant bird that chases Aladdin through Agrabah, like a giant parrot. Now, they never call Iago a roc, I'm pretty sure, because this is a relatively short scene, but given that Aladdin is a story we talked about being from 1001 Nights, I think that this is a pretty reasonable reference to talk about. It has some root in the Roc somehow. Now, if you know about the Roc, it's probably from Dungeons & Dragons, like I mentioned earlier. In D&D 5e, Rocs are about CR11, which is a decently powerful monster. You're going to need to be strong to stand a chance against one in a fight. They don't have any supernatural abilities, by the way, or anything silly like that. They're just hard-hitting flying monsters. Occasionally, giants tame them and use them as flying mounts, which is really cool. Another cool D&D lore note I found, by the way, is that in D&D 2nd edition, rocks were said to guard the lair of, wait for it, simurgs. At least until the simurgs were old enough to fend for themselves. So rocks would, like, guard simurgs. That's really cool. Pathfinder by Paizo, which is a series I'm going to mention a lot because I love Pathfinder. The rock from that series is very similar to D&D's rock, although it's slightly weaker. But they're a viable choice of animal companion in 1st edition Pathfinder. If you haven't read the 1st edition Pathfinder animal companion list, it's really cool. Also, speaking of Pathfinder, the computer RPG Pathfinder Kingmaker has a quest where you're tasked in retrieving a roc's egg. I had a whole joke written in a prior draft about a great D&D plot hook, about getting a roc's egg for an NPC that wants to make a huge omelet, and then I found out that Kingmaker already did that! So, good job, Kingmaker. I can't stay mad at you. I love you. I love Pathfinder. Now, as I said in the Cerberus episode, it could be an elaborate prank, because I'm not gonna go double check, but apparently My Little Pony Friendship is Magic features rocks in an episode. These rocks hunt down and eat baby dragons, and I think that's actually a really cool lore note. Friendship is Magic is such a weird phenomenon of a show, and I'm gonna leave it at that. Now, I first learned about the concept of a rock from Legend of Zelda, believe it or not, which is a game where there are no proper rocks in existence. In my favorite Zelda game, The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap, one of the last items you acquire in the game is called the Roc's Cape, which is a cape that allows you to jump and glide, which in Zelda is not a thing you can normally do until the most recent games. At least in the top-down Zeldas, jumping is a very rare mechanic. You receive this item in the Air Elemental dungeon, by the way, which is a really nice touch. The Roc's Cape also appears in other Zelda titles under the name the Roc's Feather, but it has the same function. It's in Oracle of Seasons, Oracle of Ages, Four Swords Adventures, and Link's Awakening. Again, it lets you jump, less gliding though. Wind Waker has no items based off of the rock, although it does have a boss called the Helmarok King, which is a rock with a helmet, basically. Wind Waker also has the first appearance of these common enemies called Kargaroks, which are really cool because they carry monsters onto the battlefield and like hot drop them on you, which is a really, really interesting way of bringing the rock lore into this new monster. So there's no doubt in my mind that they are inspired by the rock, which is nice in a series that typically likes creating its own monsters. The Lord of the Rings has a reference to rocks in that of the giant eagles, a race of huge birds that I made a joke about earlier. They also could have made things a lot easier in the Fellowship of the Ring than just flying them to Mordor. Yeah, you've heard that before. I know there are reasons why they couldn't do it, but hear me out. They could have flown the dwarves to the Lonely Mountain in The Hobbit. These giant eagles, by the way, are either giant sentient animals or, much more interestingly, angels, perhaps? That's new. In Dwarf Fortress, a game I've never played that terrifies me and fascinates me because it's one of the most complex games out there, look it up. Rocks are a type of enemy called a mega beast, which is, I understand it, is a type of terrifying world boss. They are the largest flying enemy in the game, but with enough trouble, they're kind of tameable, and with the right precautions, you can sort of domesticate them and feed your dwarves rock eggs, which is pretty cool. Brings a whole new meaning to rock and stone, am I right, brothers? Listen, I've only gone into the script with one rock pun at this point. You gotta give me this. Believe it or not, Scooby-Doo only has the appearance of a rock in one of the comics called Rock Around the Clock. I suppose that counts, but with how many episodes of Scooby-Doo we've gotten at this point, I'm surprised there's only been one. There's probably Big Birds and other episodes. I haven't seen every episode of Scooby-Doo, believe it or not. So last but not least from this selection I've chosen is Final Fantasy, because Final Fantasy is going to come up a lot. Has a lot of monsters in it over the like 16,000 games that we've got. Rocks appear in Final Fantasy V as a common enemy, and most Final Fantasy games have some sort of giant bird that you get to fight. In some of the games, they're called the Rukh, like using the other spelling we talked about. In some games, they're called the Zoo or the Stratoavis. In the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy Also, in the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV, one of the games of all time, there's a mission called Rock of Ages, very nice, where the boss is a rock. It's surprisingly hard to find out information about Final Fantasy XIV, so I don't really have more to say than that, I'm sorry. Now, I think that's about it. Ultimately, we're left with simultaneously very vague specifics, as well as very large consistencies between every version of the rock that is mentioned. They're always large enough to carry around elephants and other large animals, as well as inspire terror in anyone unfortunate to come in contact with them. Giant terrifying birds of prey are a universally understandable monster, and if I were to detail a giant bird of prey large enough to pick up even the biggest animals, I think that the imagination doing a lot of the heavy lifting is actually in the creature's benefit. Time and time again, I think the scariest things that we can imagine are the things conjured up by our own brains. The most scared I've ever been are in times in which I've made up some unfathomably specific and terrifying scenario in my own head. Writing that down could literally never compare to what I came up with. So, therefore, by only telling us specific facts about the rock, I think that we have the room to come up with the scariest image we possibly can, which is, in my opinion, a fantastic piece of world building. Now, without further ado, here's the wrap segment for this episode, titled Bigger Than Biggest.
You ever seen a bird this fucking fly? Everything's fine till you sat on my island and spawned me a poacher from up upon high. If you're wondering whether the weather clips with my feathers, that's just absurd. Sorry, because I don't think that you heard I'm bigger than biggest when it comes to birds. Nobody's caring about cassowaries, bitch, you'll have lost if you're up in ostrich. You can scream and start going for moas, I can take a whole elephant hostage. There's no use mourning for Epiorna, so later Mercator, I cannot be beat. Big versus Zeka's like sesame seeds, compared to the mega beast sweeping the streets. Here in the round that this rock drops, I'll leave you sunk when I drop rocks. Semi-Garuda and Ziz, guess after this, even with all of their flaws. If you disturb my nest and scramble my eggs, there's no escape because it's outside, and I take a flight and we'll fiercely fight for each of 1,001 or more nights. The height of my flight, up in the sky, it's just like my wingspan thousands of feet. The genie is faster, but genies is faster than anything that he would dare to come after me. I've been ruling the roost ever since the day that I was first introduced. That's one bird with one stone to leave you and your whole crew juiced.
If you know anything about the rock that I didn't mention, please tell me about it in the comments. I love to learn more about it. I'm always excited to hear of other people's stories of these monsters, and let's be honest, storytelling is the crux of monstrous legends in the first place. Next episode, we'll be heading back to ancient Greece and talking about what is one of my favorite mythological monsters of all time, the Chimera. It's gonna be a good time, and I cannot wait to keep writing more episodes of this show. So, thank you so much for watching. It really means the world to me. If you could take the time to drop a like or a comment or a subscription, I would really, really appreciate it. And if you want more of whatever my dumb deal is, you can follow me on Twitter or on TikTok at Mothmancha, Instagram at Manchadex. I'm focusing on this series right now as my main thing, but I'm everywhere on the internet. I've got tons of things going on. I can't wait to make more episodes of this. I haven't been this excited to create in months. But until next time, thanks for watching, and go make yourself a nice omelet.